Many years ago now, I lived in Florida with my then fiancée, Claire. She was my high school sweetheart and the love of my life. A small, petite little thing who couldn't scare a mouse even if she wanted to. Not that she would. She's got a heart of gold. Money was tight for us back then, and I worked night shifts at a gas station to help ease our financial woes. It goes without saying that I hated the hours, but it paid decently. And at a time when I'd have sold my left nut to eat a nice meal at a restaurant, rather than have another microwave meal, who was I to complain? It was while working there that I met Angela, a customer who I became friendly with over the course of a couple of weeks. She was a decently attractive girl, a few years my senior and a bit overweight, but she appeared to be a normal, funny person. That's the thing with people who plan on screwing up your life. They don't come to you as a mindless crazy. Those people you know not to interact with. But because of how ordinary Angela appeared to be, I started chatting with her every time she came into the store. In hindsight, it was a little strange that this woman would come to the store every night and spend a good long while just chatting with me. Most times not even buying anything. But the night shifts were dull, and I guess I welcomed the company. She'd always come in at those weird hours because of her insomnia. She refused to take sleeping pills or anything like that because she hated the idea of taking drugs. Funny. The more and more she came into the store, the more I started to realize that she probably wasn't taking some other types of drugs that she should be. After a while, cracks started to appear. I don't know whether she felt comfortable enough around me to let out her real self, or she just couldn't contain that level of crazy any longer. It was the way she acted, and the strange things she said. Like how she had bet that my blood smelled really nice, like a perfume. She had dropped these lines into casual conversation. At some point, I must have made it obvious that I wasn't single, because she asked me what my girl's name was. I didn't want to give her real name, so I just made one up on the spot. Phoebe. I guess I'd been watching Friends that week. It became apparent that Angela was obsessed with me. That's not my ego talking. She literally confessed that she was in love with me and wanted to have my babies. Sorry. I just told you about my fiancé. Her face didn't change, like that wasn't even an issue. So, no can do. How serious can it be? I don't even see an engagement ring, she replied. Well, money's tight. We haven't even set a date for the wedding yet, so... Without hesitation, she blurts out, I'll give you $200 to fuck me. Double if you get me pregnant. Anything you want if you dump your whore of a fiancé. Shell-shocked, I muttered, Get out, please. With that, she left the store. She didn't come in the following night, or the night after that. Well, I guess she got the message, I thought to myself. A couple more days pass, and it's a Saturday afternoon. I'd been out by myself walking our dog, Albert, and was on my way back home since my parents were coming over to our place for a late lunch. When I arrive back home, Claire fills me in on something. Apparently, some woman had come to the door and was asking to talk to me. Said that she was one of my co-workers. She also greeted my fiancée as Phoebe. Shit, Angela's found where I live. I explained to Claire who this nutjob was, and that she was obsessed with me. Thankfully, she knew me well enough to know that I wasn't having an affair behind her back. Being the trusting person she was, Claire invited Angela in, telling her I'd be back soon. She followed her inside to wait for me. Thankfully, my parents and a couple of family friends were already there. At one point, whilst waiting for me to get back, Claire went to use the bathroom. When she came back down, Angela had gone. Just walked out without saying a word, according to the others. I hated the fact that Angela knew where I lived, and that she'd been stalking me. I considered calling the police, but stupidly, I decided to think it over instead. The rest of the afternoon was uneventful, and went by far too quickly. My shift was starting soon, and I was dreading the inevitable return of Angela, back with a vengeance. Claire was already in bed when it came time for me to leave. Just as I was getting ready to head out, I noticed Albert was sniffing at one of the small closet doors, scratching at it and whimpering. Great, we've got rats, I assumed. Come on, Albert, let's take a look then. I opened the closet, and there was Angela, crouched down in the small space under the stairs. Her eyes were wild. One of her hands was clasped over her mouth to hush her breathing. In the other, she held a small knife. You bet your ass that I didn't hesitate to call the police now. Thankfully, she dropped the knife pretty much instantly, and didn't put up much resistance, just bad-mouthing my fiancée, calling her an ugly whore, and begging me to give her a shot instead, as if saying all this would make the situation better for her in some way. The cops arrived, and took her away with little trouble, Claire in tears at the whole situation, me shaking due to a mixture of rage, fear, and confusion. Angela admitted to everything. According to her confession, she knew that I was out of the house when she knocked on the door. That was her plan all along. She hadn't come to talk to me. She came to murder my fiancé. She had brought that concealed knife with her to do so. In her mind, with Claire out of the picture, I'd be all hers, and we'd run away together. What she didn't know was that my parents and our family friends were there too. She followed me in her car to make sure I'd be gone long enough, during which time our guests arrived. When she saw them inside, she knew that she'd have to wait. When Claire went to the bathroom, Angela left the room with my parents in. But she didn't walk out the front door as everyone assumed. Instead, she quietly stowed herself away in that small closet, waiting for the others to leave. She knew my shifts like the back of her hand, so when I returned to the house, she figured she'd wait until I went to work. That way the house would be nice and empty, and at that point she'd be able to murder my fiancé. Along with the blade, she had brought a whole bunch of pictures of me, taken without my knowledge. They were of me inside the store, taken from outside, of me in the car, of me just walking around town. This woman had literally been chronicling my everyday life since I met her. Why she brought the photos along with her, I have no idea. It's extremely creepy to think that she was in that house with us the entire day, especially when you consider what she was planning. We moved out of state not long after this, not because we thought Angela might escape and come after us again, but because Claire didn't feel at home in that house anymore, as if it was tainted by Angela's actions. As I said, this all took place many years ago, and I can now happily say that Claire and I did eventually get married. We now have 2 beautiful children, and the whole Angela incident is far behind us. Though I still lay awake at night sometimes, thinking about how everything you hold dear in this world can be taken away from you by some lunatic. It's only pure dumb luck that I noticed Albert's whining, and just before I left as well. What would have happened had I actually left for work doesn't bear thinking about. The following account occurred roughly 3 years ago, during the summer of 2012. It's always been difficult for me to talk about this, but I found writing about it to be therapeutic. I was 17, and I had just gotten my first job. I lived in rural Western Virginia, in a small mountain community. My mum's friend owned a camping resort not too far away from my house that had a general store, and she said that she'd pay me to help out in the store during the busy summer months. It was a pretty easy job, and I met a lot of out-of-towners, which was nice, because our community could get a little isolated. Most of us lived pretty far away from each other. One day, a big burly mountain man type of guy came into the store. He must have been in his late 40s or early 50s, probably around 6'5" and about 280 pounds. He looked dirty, like he worked outside a lot. His clothes were sort of tattered, and he had a long beard. We had a few of the woodsy hermit types in our area, and he definitely looked like one of them. He bought some basic items, one of which was one of our handmade bars of soap. When he came to the register, he looked me up and down carefully. He didn't talk for a minute. He just stared. His people skills clearly needed some work. "Did you make this soap?" he asked gruffly. "Possibly," I said. "I help out with that sometimes." "Do you make a lot of your own stuff?" Toiletries and things like that, yeah." I like that," he said, nodding to himself. I honestly didn't know how to respond. I quickly rang up his items and he paid with some crumpled money. Right before he left, he asked, "Do you cook too?" Sometimes," I replied. "I bet the boys around here are itching to marry you," he said as he smiled to himself. I was puzzled as to what I said that stood out as wife material. I told Krista, my mum's friend and my boss, about the bizarre encounter, and she just laughed it off. So did my family and friends. But then, Mountain Man turned up more often. We chatted a little bit here and there, and I found out that he had a cabin in the woods. He claimed he built it with his bare hands. He said he hunted and lived off the land, other than the things he bought in our store. Over time, our chatter escalated, with him making comments about how nice it would be to have a woman like me around who could make him nice things, and cook his kills. One time, he even said I had those birthin' hips that men lust after. He even started to invite me to go fishing with him, hunt with him, see his place, etc. I always politely declined, but he got more and more insistent, and I told Krista about how uncomfortable he was starting to make me. The intensity with which he said those things was really scaring me. She said that whenever he came in, to go to her and she would ring him up instead. Thanks to her, I started speaking to him less, and I thought I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. But one night, I was closing up, and it was late, around 10 at night. Krista had left about an hour before, and I was leaving by myself. The only two cars in front of our store were an old blue pickup and mine. I was immediately alarmed, because I knew Mountain Man drove a blue pickup. But I didn't see him in the parking lot, just his car, so I walked quickly to my car and checked the back seat before I started her up. But then, when I first turned the key in the ignition, I got nothing but sputters. I tried several more times and got scared quickly. Of all nights, why is this happening tonight? I remember asking myself angrily. Just as I reached for my phone to call for help, there was a loud pounding on the driver's side window. I'm shocked that I didn't piss myself there and then. I didn't even want to look, because I knew it was him. But I did, and my suspicions were confirmed. He smiled, a big grin at me, showing me exactly which teeth were missing. "Need some help?" he said loudly through the window. I shook my head furiously. "My dad's on his way," I said, hoping to scare him off. I hadn't spoken to my dad in years. No, he's not, he said. Open the door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up straight. How did he know I was bluffing? No, I said firmly. Leave me alone. Suddenly, he looked angry. He pulled the handle, but I'd locked all the doors when I first got in. He kept furiously pulling the handle and started pounding on the window. Leave now, or I'm calling the cops, I screamed at him. He clearly wasn't getting the message, so I pulled out my phone and called 911. I must have sounded hysterical to the dispatcher, and I knew she could hear him pounding. She said she would have an officer out ASAP, but out here, that could be a while. The cops are on their way. Leave now, I shouted at Mountain Man, who didn't seem to let that deter him. But after a few more minutes of pounding, he suddenly stopped and walked back to his truck. I watched him go, hopeful that he would leave me alone. But then he started walking back towards me, with a fucking crowbar in hand. No, I screamed at him. Get the fuck away from me. He started to swing at the driver's side window with the crowbar. I ducked down into the passenger seat on the floor and covered the back of my neck like they teach you in tornado drills. I heard the sickening crack of the window, but not for long. Suddenly, I heard male voices shouting, telling Mountain Man to get away from the car. I sat up and saw two men approaching, one with a shotgun pointed at Mountain Man. I recognized them as a couple of guests staying at the resort for a camping trip. I breathed a sigh of relief and got out of the car, telling them that the police were on their way. I thanked them profusely as we waited for the police, and surprisingly, Mountain Man didn't make any moves to get away, but the cops came pretty quickly after that, so he didn't have much of a chance anyway. They took him away, and I gave them my statement. And I was pretty shaken up for a while afterwards. And a few weeks later, I finally got the scoop on the man. Apparently, he had a history of mental illness. He'd been in and out of state institutions. He really had been living in an old cabin in the woods, where he wasn't taking his medication, and his issues were only getting worse. My cousin Luke is a cop, and later on, he told me more about the case, which he learned through some other officers. The police did a search of his cabin after the incident to see if there was anything that might be of interest to them. They found a journal that Mountain Man kept. Apparently, in it, he said he was lonely and wanted a wife. Thanks to my stupid name tag, he mentioned me by name a lot. Luke said there were a lot of lewd things in there that he didn't want to share, but he tried to put it simply by saying that Mountain Man had a detailed plan to abduct me, starting with sabotaging my car engine to get me in a more vulnerable position. When Luke said that, I nearly burst into tears, thinking about how horribly that night could have gone if those two men hadn't come along. Thankfully, Mountain Man's been put back into a state institution. With any luck, he'll stay there for good. Number 2.